Hello guys, good day. It's your Sir Kevin O, and this is my discussion on accounting for leases of IFRS 16 or PFRS 16. Without further ado, let's start with this one guys by giving you an overview of how the discussion is going to run. So guys, i-divide natin to into three parts. First, we'll take lease accounting and a few general concepts to get you oriented kung nakalimutan nyo na. And then, we'll proceed with lessor accounting. And lastly, we'll do sale and lease back. Okay, let's take up the first one. Lessee accounting and general concepts. Let's start by answering, what is a lease? Well, generally, a lease is a contract outlining the terms under which one party agrees to rent property owned by another party. So the keyword there is rent, and another one could be contract. It is a formal rent, whereby it grants the lessee, also known as the tenant, the use of an asset, and the lessor, the property owner or landlord, regular payments for specified period in exchange. So, a lease is a contract of rent. The parties in a lease agreement, again, as mentioned earlier, are the lessor and the lessee. Lessor, property owner, landlord, ito siya yung nag-lend ng asset niya in exchange for payments that will be paid by your lessee, the tenant. The payments could be either one time or a periodic payment. Depende na lang yan sa agreement nilang dalawa. Now let's focus on lessee accounting first, as I mentioned earlier. Well, lessee accounting, guys, generally, the lessee will account for a lease as a finance lease. In fact, it is stated in IFRS 16 that all leases shall be accounted for as finance lease by the lessee. Pero may konting exception. Unless the lease agreement is classified as low value and or short term. As to determining what low value or short term is, it is not particularly stated in the standard, pero it can be inferred depending on the nature and size of the business. Pero siguro by way of common sense, alam natin na yung short term, that is yung 1 year or less. Pero as to low value, that is still subject to the judgment of an accountant. Okay, ano naman ngayon sir if it's low value or short term? In which case, the lessee may opt to account for it as operating lease. So, in terms of answering how the lessee accounts for a lease, merong dalawa. Either choose finance lease or operating lease. Generally, lahat ng leases finance lease. Pero may konting exception. Pwede po piliin ni lessee yung operating lease. Pero may dalawang kondisyon, or at least one of the two conditions. Okay, pwede. Pero even if a lease is low value or short term, the lessee may nevertheless account for it as a finance lease. Kasi po option lang ang operating lease. Okay? Now that we got that out of the way, let's start first with operating lease. Well, in operating lease, guys, the lease is accounted for in the same manner as ordinary rent. Ano yung ordinary rent? The lessee will record lease payments as rent expense proportionately throughout the lease term. Okay, this one is divided into two thoughts. The lessee will record lease payments as rent expense. Let's stop there for a moment. Okay, kapag ikaw nakatira ka sa property na hindi sa'yo pero pinarentahan sa'yo, for every month or for every year, you will have to accrue rent expense. And with that, you will have to record also rent payable. So dalawa lang essentially ang operating lease. You will have to recognize rent expense and rent payable. Other things could include security deposits, rents paid in advance, for which mag-a-apply po dito yung accrual basis of accounting, or kung advance payment of rent naman, of course, deferrals. So those things. Also, sometimes the lessee would be made to pay maintenance charges, for which it is also treated as an expense. Okay, pero the main thought really here is, all rent payments will simply constitute expense. Nagtatapon ka lang ng pera dito kasi you will only really lead to expense. Pero of course, the use of the building is good. Now, on the second thought, proportionately throughout the lease term. Let's say 5 years ka po magli-lease under an operating lease. What it means when we say proportionately throughout the lease term is that in that 5 years, dapat po the total amount paid in terms of rent, i-allocate mo dapat yan proportionately throughout the lease term. There are instances where in the lease payments on the first year, second year, until the 5th year are not going to be equal. Pero regardless of what amount was paid on each of the years, you will still have to divide equally the rent expense. So kunin mo yung total rent paid, divide that by 5 years, that should be your rent expense throughout the years. We'll have more of that when we arrive in problem solving. Pero for now, let's go ahead with our general review of the concepts. Let's proceed to finance lease, which is the meat of the discussion. First, of course, let's be practical with how this goes. Upon entering into a lease agreement, the lessee will typically record this entry under a finance lease. Una, a debit of right-of-use asset and paired with a credit na lease liability. So in a finance lease, you will essentially record an asset and a liability. So compare that with operating lease. Sa operating lease, ano ang meron ka? An expense and a liability. Pero sa finance lease, you will not immediately expense your payments. Rather, ika-capitalize mo po ang future payments mo into a right-of-use asset. The debit to right-of-use asset represents the right to occupy the property. Or, in other words, we term this one as usufructuary. So, the usufructuary is going to be debited as an asset in our books. So, paki-compare siya again. Dito, finance lease, ika-capitalize ang lease payments. Pero, in operating lease, it's expensed immediately. Yun ang fundamental difference nila. Now, the debit is right-of-use asset and the credit is lease liability. The lease liability credit is a present value figure actually. It represents the present value of the entire lease payments throughout the lease term. So for example, kung ang agreement ni lessor and lessee is that the lease is going to last for 5 years, all of the payments in that 5 years will have to be expressed in present value and it will be recognized as a lease liability. That's the gist of it. Of course, there will be other factors. So right now, what you're seeing is there is only one debit and one credit, ano? So, sir, do you mean that the right-of-use asset is equal to the lease liability? In a simple problem, that might be the case. Pero sometimes, the lessor may be made to pay initial direct costs. What are these initial direct costs? We'll talk about them later. Pero ito yung outflow in order for the lessee to be able to start with the lease. Okay, additional outflow. Initial cash out ba? And if you would observe by this entry alone, guys, it would imply that if you have initial direct cost, that will be added to the capitalizable amount of right-of-use asset. That's the idea of finance lease. Yung magagasto mo in the future at gagastuhin mo right now when you agree on the lease, you can capitalize it. Okay? We'll talk about those things in the next slides. Let's start first with our lease liability. Na-mention ko na to kanina, it represents the present value of lease payments over the lease term. So lahat po ng ibabayad mo in the future, you're expecting to pay, for example, 1 million total. Yang 1 million na yan, kailangan i-present value mo. Okay? Then, what rate is going to be used to express the payments in present value? You use implicit rate or incremental borrowing rate if the prior cannot be determined. So, priority, gamitin mo ay implicit rate. Pero kung hindi ma-identify ang implicit rate, you can also use the incremental borrowing rate of the lessee. Your lease liability will be comprised of the following components. Una, of course, lease payments, which is mentioned in the definition, present value of lease payments, present value of option to purchase, and present value of guaranteed residual value. LOG. Pero to be more particular with this, guys, do remember in a problem, option to purchase and guaranteed residual value cannot exist together. They are substitute of each other. Kung may option to purchase, normally walang guaranteed residual value. Kung may guaranteed residual value, normally walang option to purchase. And I will explain that in the next few slides. Let's start with option to purchase. What is it? It is an offer by the lessor to sell the asset to the lessee after the lease term for a sum of consideration. So, parang si lessor nag-o-offer ng ganito. I will allow you to rent this property for 5 years, pero at the end of the 5 years, I will let you decide. If you like the property, I will let you decide. Kung gusto mo sa'yo na ang property, bilhin mo yan sa akin for this amount of option purchase that I am offering you right now. So, binibigyan ka ni lessor ng offer to purchase by the end of the lease term. So, it's still up to the lessee if he is going to buy or not, pero that option stands. Now, what happens is, if this is thrown by the lessor to the lessee, the intent of the lessor is to dispose of the asset, of course, because you gave the lessee the option to buy it. The option will be part of the lease liability if the lessee will exercise it with reasonable certainty. If this is the case, the leased asset will be transferred to the lessee. So ngayon naman, since nag-offer si lessor kay lessee, it is now going to be the decision of the lessee if i-avail ba natin to or not. Now, if the lessee has decided na maybe 99% gusto ko siya i-avail kasi it's tempting, sino ba naman ang aayaw na magiging sayo na yung property, di ba? So if the lessee is reasonably certain na bibilhin niya yung asset after the lease term, then dapat ang amount ng option at its present value should be included in the lease liability. After exercise, the leased asset will become the property of the lessee. Simple as that. It's a transfer of asset if i-exercise niya. On the flip side, yung guaranteed residual value naman, guys, it is a guarantee on the fair value of the asset after the lease term. This renders the lessee responsible in maintaining the asset leased. Guaranteed residual value. Iga-guarantee ang residual value. This one, it normally occurs when the asset is expected to revert to the lessor after the lease term. Or, ibig sabihin, si lessor gusto niyang ma-preserve yung asset kasi babawiin niya pa. Or, he still wants to use the asset for some other purpose in the future. And he definitely does not want the lessee to just thrash the asset. Di niya gusto masira yung asset. Now, if the lessee is unable to properly maintain the leased asset, in that its fair value falls below the guaranteed amount, the lessee will be liable to the lessor for the discrepancy. Example, let's say nag-agree si lessee to guarantee a residual value of 500,000 to the lessor. Sabihin niya kay lessor, Lessor, I promise you, by the end of the lease term, this asset will have a fair value of 500,000. Maibibenta mo pa to at 500,000. Pirma, lease contract. That's guaranteed residual value. Now, what if at the end of the lease term, pina-appraise ni lessor yung asset sa isang independent appraiser? Then it was found out na ang fair value na lang ng asset is 300,000. Ano mangyayari dito? Nag-promise si lessee ng 500,000 pero at the end ang value 300,000 na lang. The lessee will be made to answer the discrepancy of 200,000 by means of a settlement payment, or it can be in the form of assets. More commonly, it can be in the form of cash payment. So babayaran niya yung missing na 200,000. Okay. Guaranteed residual value is essentially a liability of the lessee because it represents the lessee's responsibility to return the asset in a good condition. Which is why, if there is guaranteed residual value, that is going to be liability ni lessee included in lease liab. Gets? Again, it represents the responsibility to return the asset. Okay, moving on. Purchase option and guaranteed residual value. Side by side. The presence of a reasonably certain purchase option implies that the asset will be transferred to the lessee. On the other hand, the presence of a guaranteed residual value implies that the asset will revert to the lessor. By way of presumption, the two items cannot exist in one problem since they indicate two opposing outcomes on the termination of the lease. What are these opposing outcomes, sir? Okay. The first one, when there is a purchase option, it implies na ang asset po magta-transfer in ownership. Magiging kay lessee na. Pero kung may guaranteed residual value, the asset will not be transferred to the lessee. Rather, it will remain owned by the lessor. Scenario 1, ita-transfer kay lessee. Scenario 2, ibabalik yan kay lessor after gamitin ni lessee. Meaning, itong dalawang scenario na to, option to purchase and guaranteed residual value, hindi yan sila pwede magsama sa isang problem. Fundamentally, hindi yan pwede magsama sa isang problem. Pero about legalities, I am not so certain. Pero I'm pretty sure, guys, in problem solving, you would not observe the two in one problem. Next, lessee lease liability. If you remember the entry earlier, ano yung entry ulit? Debit right of use asset, credit lease liability, di ba? Na-explain na natin ng konti yung lease liability. Ano yung components niya ulit? LOG. Present value of lease payments, present value of the option, and the present value of guaranteed residual value. Pero yung debit natin is a right of use asset. That is what we will talk about right now. Ano yung right of use asset? What is this asset? Ano yun ulit? It represents the usufructuary. Yes, usufructuary can be recognized as an asset now. In a finance lease, the lessee will record a right of use asset equally to the lease liability plus any initial direct cost. So whatever is the lease liab, i-add mo dito yung initial direct cost, yan na yung right of use asset mo. Pero to be more particular in this one, the components of right of use asset can be summarized in three categories. There may be other categories or components of this, pero generally ito yung kasama sa mga problems. Initial direct cost at face value. Kasi po ang initial direct cost, binabayaran yan pronto. Restoration cost at the end of the lease term. Ano to? This is a contractual agreement between the lessor and the lessee to dismantle any installed equipment, to restore land to its condition before the lease, etc. You know, just like in PPE. You need to express the restoration cost agreement at present value. And then, the lease liability, which comprises of lease payments, option to purchase, and guaranteed residual value. Of course, isasama mo din sa right of use asset. Right of use asset. The right of use asset will be subject to depreciation or amortization if it is an intangible asset. Pero more commonly, guys, ang nililease po is PPE. Yung mga na-encounter natin na problems, PPE most of the time. Pero again, it can be amortization if it is involving, let's say, for example, intangible assets. Okay, it's depreciated. How? First one, if the ownership of the lease asset will transfer to the lessee, meaning kung matatransfer kay lessee yung asset, bibilhin ni lessee yung asset by way of provision in the contract or by way of purchase option. Kung merong dalawang situation na yan, then the asset will be depreciated using its useful life. So, ito ha, use the appropriate depreciation method and gamitin mo po ang useful life to depreciate that amount. Then, second option. Yung first one, it is kung matatransfer kay lessee, di ba? Itong pangalawa naman, if the ownership will be retained by the lessor. Kung hindi itatransfer ang asset kay lessee, then the leased asset will be depreciated based on the shorter of useful life and lease term. Itong dalawang to. You need to pick which is shorter. Is the useful life shorter or the lease term? Lessee, the lessee will be depreciating the asset, pero if the asset will not belong to him at the end of the lease term, you will have to choose. Okay? Ito yung rules. In terms of finance lease, depreciation of right of use asset or ROA. Next, ROA, yung components ng ROA, yung IRL, di ba? Yung I, it stands for initial direct cost. What are these initial direct costs? They are costs necessary to the lease. Without these costs, the lease could not have been agreed to. So, basahin mo yung definition. They are necessary costs. Kung hindi mo bayaran to, the lease could not be originated or it could not be commenced. Okay? Ito yung binabayad mo sa lawyer in order to make sure that the provisions of the contract are well, proper, and good, and of course fair, and other things that are necessary. Okay? Initial direct cost will be classified as addition to right of use asset if the lessee shoulders initial direct costs. There is a little bit of a problem there because sometimes, even if the lessee has already paid for initial direct costs, lease incentives may be included. What are lease incentives? These are lessor's reimbursements. Or if the lessor reimburses or assumes the cost of the lessee, nagbayad na si lessee pero ni-reimburse siya ni lessor. We call that lease incentive. Or one more thing, if there is an initial direct cost and the lessor paid for it, pero ni-reimburse ni lessee si lessor. So ano to? Magkabaliktad sila. Lease incentive, lessor reimburse the lessee. Lease bonus, lessee reimburses the lessor. Well, if all of these three are present in a problem, you just have to remember that they must be treated as follows. The initial direct costs minus lease incentives plus lease bonus is your net initial direct cost. That should be the one added to your ROA at face value. Okay? So that's initial direct cost. We have already talked about lease liability, but we don't have anything on restoration costs. Pero for restoration costs, guys, it's the same as in past 16. Pero dito, you will have to express the restoration cost at their present value. That's for finance lease under the lessee side. Now let's proceed into a few problems on general operating lease and finance lease lessee. Okay? Okay guys, let's start problems with operating lease muna. Starting with number 21 and number 22. Itong mga problem na to po, they are simple operating lease problems. So let's go about with this. First, of course, let's go with number 21, which requires us the total expense that Iliad should report in its December 31, 2017, profit or loss. So, total expenses. Let's read the given. You know that this is December 1, 2017 based on what's written here, and that a lease for 5 years has been agreed at a monthly rental of 60,000. Okay, that is already a candidate for an expense that we will be recognizing in 2017. Also, on the same date, the company paid the lessor the following amounts. Binayaran to lahat. Una, first month rent. Pangalawa, last month rent. Then, security deposit, 80,000. Installation of new walls and offices, 360. So, ang property na nirentahan natin is an office space. We installed walls and maybe setup for the office. This could be building improvements. 360,000. 80,000. 60 last month and first month is 60. Based on the given, I can say that for the 5 years, we will be paying 60,000 monthly. So, flat rate. That is already a proportionate division of the rent expense. So, we don't really have a problem on the portion saying rent expense. We can conclude, therefore, na ang 60,000 on my calcu right now, I will just put it on Memory Plus because that will be included as an expense for 2017. Why do I say so? Kasi ito yung monthly rental, di ba? And we started rental on December 1, 2017. That is precisely 1 month up to December 31, 2017. So okay, meron na tayo expense. So itong 60,000 for the first month is definitely an expense. Next, how about the last month rent? Knowing accrual basis of accounting, this is an advance payment of rent, di ba? So such is not yet an expense but rather a prepaid rent. Next, security deposit. Itong security deposit naman guys, this is refundable at lease expiration. Kapag refundable ang security deposit, that means that this is going to be recorded as a receivable from lessor and not as a rent expense. So that is also out of the picture. Sir, how about if non-refundable? Diyan na po tayo magkakaroon ng problema. If it is non-refundable, it will be considered as part of your rent expense proportionately throughout the lease term. Pero since refundable tayo, don't include it kasi ang tinatanong expense. How about this one? Installation of new walls and offices. Well, that part would mean that that this amount could possibly become lease improvements, di ba? And because of that, lease improvements will have to be amortized or depreciated over the lease term of 5 years. So, pardon me for the terrible writing here, 5 years. Over 5. Yun po, 360. So, naka-Memory Plus na yung 60,000 natin. Kunin natin yung 360,000 divided by 5 years. Ito yung annual depreciation ng leasehold improvements natin. However, for 2017, we only have 1 month. I-divide ulit natin ang 72,000 na to because this is for 1 year. Divided by 12 months, we will get the rate for only 1 month, which is 6,000. So all in all, what we did is we only got the portion of the 360 that applies for 1 month over 12 months. Okay? So that's how everything happened. Memory plus this one, memory recall. What I would get is a total figure of 66,000, your correct answer for number 21. Okay? So, these are the items that can be included in an operating lease problem. Pero there might be others. For that, let us proceed to number 22, which is also an operating lease problem. And in this problem, guys, we are now on the side of the lessor. Upon reading the requirement pa lang, alam mo na kagad na lessor ang tinatanong or lessor ang problem na to because it's asking for rent revenue. Yung kanina, yung first problem natin, of course, it is a lessee problem because yung tinatanong po is expense. You should try to develop a skill wherein the very first thing that you will read will give you a hint kung anong type ang problem na sinosolve mo. So that even before you start the problem, alam mo na kung nasaan ang direction mo. Okay? It's like setting the direction or setting the goals. Ito po. Kanina, lessee, ngayon naman, lessor. So let's read this one. Rent revenue ang tinatanong, and that is rent revenue for the fiscal year ended June 30, 2018. Also, make it a habit to always keep note of the dates. Like for example, in this problem, something that is not common is this one has a fiscal year ended June 30. So meaning year end niya po yung June 30, 2018. Okay? Yan. Ang problem natin, it is of July 1, 2017, yung information. So, from July 1, 2017 to June 30, 2018, that is one whole fiscal year. July 1, Pat Company leased a piece of land from Luke Corporation under 3-year operating lease. Total rent for the term of the lease will be $3,600,000. payable as follows. Okay, this is an example of a problem wherein there is an uneven rental payments for each year. So, 3 years, pero yung rentals, nagkakaroon po ng increments of, ano tong increments na to? I can't really determine what amount right now, pero observe, magkakaiba po ang annual rental payable natin, yung actual cash na ibabayad. Pero here is one rule that you should always remember with operating lease. Regardless of how much you pay for each year, dapat po ang pag-allocate natin ng revenue on the lessor side, tapos pag-allocate ng expense on the lessee side, that should be proportionately throughout the lease term. So if I would sum up all of these, it is actually going to be equal to 3,600,000, di ba? Do the math right now. So 2,1 plus 900, 3 million, plus 600, 3,600. Ito yung total payments natin. That is the total potential expense that we will incur in this lease. When you are answering lease, operating lease, on lessee or lessor, ito po ang gagawin mo. 3,600,000, the total potential expenses that we will be incurring, divide that by the total or the lease term, which is 3 years in our problem here. Divide that by 3. This is what proportionately means. Even if we have 600,000, 900,000, and 2,100,000, it doesn't matter. We will recognize the expense proportionately at 1,200,000 per year. Importante to. Kailangan kabisado mo to by heart. Okay? Because that could be one item na maaaring bonus na sana. Pero dahil di mo alam, nasayang pa. Okay? So that's it. Proportionately, that's what it means. Our answer for number 22 is letter C. Okay? So to double up on that, guys, let's answer one more problem about operating lease. This time, we'll have item number 23. And with this, let's read through. In Zeus income statement for the year ended June 30, 2017, how much should be reported as rent expense? This time around, we are yet again on the lessee side. Rent expense ang tinatanong. So, as an inducement to enter a lease, Athena, a lessor, grants Zeus Corporation, a lessee, 9 months of free rent under a 5-year operating lease. Okay, when there is a rent-free period, wala tayong babayaran. Pero that does not necessarily mean that we will not have rent expense. Because remember the rule again, we must allocate rent expense proportionately throughout the lease term. The first 9 months, wala daw babayaran. It's free of rent. The lease is effective July 1, 2016 and provides for a monthly rental of 20,000 to begin April 1, 2017. So, April. Okay. July 1, 2016, April magsisimula yung rental payments. From July 1, 2016 up to March 31, 2017, wala tayong babayaran. Or 9 months. The first 9 months of the lease, walang babayaran. Ang saya. Pero yung tinatanong dito, guys, is what is in the income statement of Zeus? What is rent expense for June 30, 2017? Okay? Objectives. Now, the lease term is 5 years, di ba? On my calculator, 5 years. And 5 years, there are always 12 months, of course, in each of the years of those 5 years. Meaning, yung 5 years natin, meron tayong total na 60 months. However, of that 60 months, we don't need to pay rental for 9 months. So, minus 9 tayo. In short, we will only be paying for 51 months of 20,000. So, if I would multiply the 51 months times the 20,000, I will be able to arrive at an amount equal to 1,020,000. Ano yung 1,020,000 na yan? That is the expected total rental payments that I will be paying under this lease term. Yan yung total. Kumbaga, sa problem 22 natin, that is the same component of 3,600,000 earlier. Pero again, 1,020,000 is for problem 23. What you will do with this rent expense total is you will divide that by 5. Because again, to mention the principle, you need to divide the rent expense for a proportionate you need to divide the rent expense proportionately throughout the lease term. Yun lang, plain and simple. So, dividing 1,020,000 by 5 years gives me an amount equal to 204,000, which is going to be my annual rent expense. Letter D ang answer natin sa number 23. Ano yun ulit? 51 months multiplied by 20,000. You will get 1,020,000 as the total rent expense for the 5 years. I-divide mo yan by 5 years, makukuha mo po ang answer natin, letter D. So I think that's enough for operating lease. We will be proceeding to finance lease next. So guys, this is our next item. It's problem number 24. Isa lang ang requirement. And to that, I already highlighted sa baba po, right of use asset on December 31, 2017. O ngayon, pakabasa mo ng requirement, alam mo na kagad that this is a lessee problem. So our orientation is the computation of lease liab, computation of ROA. Review. Lease liab is comprised of LOG, lease payments, option to purchase, and you have your guaranteed residual value. Right of use asset will comprise of initial direct cost, restoration cost, and the lease liab. Hence, it is always important to start with lease liab kasi kasama siya sa right of use asset. So with that, let's read through the problem. December 30, 2016, Chlorine Company leased a new machine from Oxide Corporation. The following data relate to the lease transaction at the inception of the lease. So nangyari ang transaction December 30, 2016, and the requirement is 1 year after that. Take note, 1 year after. We may need to depreciate our ROA later. Lease term is 10 years. Annual rental payable is 240,000. And do take note, it is at the end of each lease term, at the end of each year. So when we start December 2016, the first payment will be December 2017. Life of the machine is 12 years. And implicit rate is 10%. So ito po importante, kailangan i-highlight. 10%, 240,000, 10 years. And 12 years as well. Of course, it's important, pero we'll need to determine kung ano ang gagamitin natin between 10 years and 12 years later. The first hurdle of the problem is to decide whether to use in advance or annuity of 1. And to that, guys, I would say always dapat magtutugma ang present value factor na gagamitin mo with your timing of the payments. Kung ang payment na gagawin is the same as the initial date, if the first payment falls on the initial date, that means you will use in advance. But if the payment is 1 year after the initial date or later than the initial date, you will use present value of ordinary annuity or annuity in arrears. Ito po, yung pangalawa. This problem, we have to eliminate annuity in advance kasi hindi naman po in advance ang problem na to. The first payment will happen after 1 year pa. Okay? I hope that much is clear. That means, if I would like to get the present value of the lease payments, I need to use 6.15 and multiply it with 240,000. I can do that right now. 240,000 multiplied by 6.15. This is a rather simple problem. That is 1,476. Ito po yung L sa lease liability. Lease payments to. There is no option to purchase in this problem and there is no guaranteed residual value. So I might as well say that this 1,476,000 is my lease liability on December 30, 2016. Okay? Yan na yung lease liability natin. Bakit? Bakit ko nasabi yon? Kasi ang 1,476, the present value of lease payments, together with O and G, if you add them together and compare them with the fair value of the machine, whichever is lower between 1,476 and 1,680, that will be the lease liab. Well, that one is lower, 1,476. Eliminate natin to. So settled, ang lease liability natin is equal to 1,476,000. Now to compute your right of use asset. Right of use asset again is comprised of I, R, and L. Well, in this problem, there is no initial direct cost given. Also, there is no restoration costs agreed, contractual. Wala po. Ang meron lang, lease liab. That would mean na ang right of use asset ko is also equal to 1,476,000, pero that is the amount on December 30, 2016 pa lang. The next hurdle of this problem is to determine ano po ang depreciation. And to that, I will need to correct a small error in this problem here kasi this one should not be chlorine, it should be oxide. Okay? Pardon me for not correcting this before the video recording, Pero, yan na po. The lease has no renewal option and the possession of the machine reverts to oxide when the lease terminates. Do take note that chlorine is our lessee. Ang may-ari po ng asset is oxide. Meaning, ibabalik natin kay oxide ang asset. Reverts to oxide. Wala namang sense kung reverts to chlorine, di ba? Kasi si chlorine siya na yung may hawak ng asset ngayon. So, reverts to oxide when the lease terminates. Yun po. Ibig sabihin neto, isasauli natin yung asset. It also means that we will only be able to enjoy using the asset during the lease term. Pero ito yung rule. If the asset will be transferred to chlorine, you will depreciate it using useful life. Pero if the asset is going to be transferred or is going to be returned to the lessor, you will have to pick between 10 years and 12 years. Lease term and estimated life, whichever is shorter. Again, if the asset is going to be returned to the lessor, you will depreciate the asset the shorter of lease term and life of the machine. To which in our problem, it is clear which is shorter, Ito po ang shorter natin, 10 years. So we will depreciate 1,476, 10 years. At isang taon pa lang po ang nakalipas kasi December 30, 2016 and December 31, 2017. Let me go ahead and use my calculator. I will commit this one. No. Di ko na i-memory plus. I-multiply na lang natin siya sa 9 years remaining over 10 years total. So, multiplied by 9 over 10. That means, ito na po ang amount niya after depreciation. 1,328,400. That is our answer. Letter A. Simple problem kasi walang guaranteed residual value, walang option to purchase. Lease liab, ROA, depreciation rule. So, keep those things in mind. You might stumble upon them in your future problems. Okay guys, for our next problem, we have Lewis Company leasing a machine from Millennium Corporation on January 1, 2017. So let's read the requirements first for this. We have 3 items, 25 to 27. Una, for the year ended December 31, 2017, what would Lewis Company record in relation to the lease? Okay, now this type of questioning is tricky kasi dapat alam mo po kung ano ang lahat ng i-record in a lease on the lessee side. Because frankly speaking, I know this is lessee because look at the options. Interest expense, interest payable. And we know that expense is on the side of the lessee. So, number 25 gives us a conclusive hint na lessee accounting po ang tinatanong dito. Number 26 only adds to that presumption because it's also asking for annual depreciation expense that Lewis should record. Also, on December 31, 2017, para sa number 27, tinatanong dito what would Lewis Company present as lease liability. So, confirmed. Lessee accounting. Lease liab, ano ang ire-record, ano ang annual depreciation. So, let's read the problem. The problem is relatively short, and it would not be too difficult for us to know the facts here. So let's go ahead and read that. Start on the second sentence. The first annual payment was made on December 31, 2017. Okay, compare that. December 31, 2017 and January 1, 2017. That means that we need to use here present value of ordinary annuity. The machine has an economic life of 6 years. The lease agreement requires 4 annual payments of 33,000. Okay, 4 annual payments, 33,000. But there's a catch. The 33,000 includes 3,000 annual payment for repairs and maintenance. Okay, itong 3,000 na to guys, that is what we call executory costs. And that is not part of your lease payments. It is not part of your lease liability. Tatanggalin natin yan mamaya. The machine will be returned to Millennium Corporation at the end of the 4-year lease term. Okay, the machine reverts to the lessor, which means that we need to ascertain kung ano ang depreciation natin na gagamitin. Is it 6 years or 4 years? Well, shorter of the two is 4 years. So, 4 years po ang depreciation ng machine natin because it will be returned to Millennium. And Lewis Company guarantees a residual value of 5,000. Okay, meron tayong guaranteed residual value for a change. Merong addition sa ating lease payments. Also, the implicit term or implicit rate is 10%, which is known to Lewis. Okay, let's start this one with number 25. Una, since interest expense and interest payable po ang tinatanong sa baba, it would be better to start computing ano ang interest expense ng December 31, 2017 before we get into more details. But in order to do that, kailangan muna natin i-compute ang lease liability. This is also the case for other problems, guys. No matter how hard you try, mas maganda talaga pagdaanan mo minsan muna yung lease liability before you proceed to the other requirements. Kung tinatanong man ang lease liability, daanan mo muna yon. Okay? So let's go ahead and solve lease liability so that we can get interest expense. January na lease liab, tapos December 31 na interest expense. For that, I will be using this solution guide. So, as you can see, there is already a term and a rate. Term of 4 years, rate of 10%, which from those terms and rates, I have already the mathematical formula for our present values here, to which I can say we won't be needing the annuity due. Ang gagamitin natin is present value of 1 and present value of annuity of 1. First, let's worry about lease payments. In our problem, the lease payments amounted to 33,000. Pero, that includes 3,000 annual payment for repairs and maintenance. Kailangan po natin tanggalin yan. So, a total of 33,000. Dapat minus ang 3,000. Kasi po, what we are looking for is what amount of payment relates to the lease. And we should exclude anything that is for executory costs. Okay? In short, ang lease payments natin is only equal to 30,000. There is also a mention of a guaranteed residual value. In our problem, ang given dito is 5,000. Guaranteed residual value, which you need to include as part of your lease liab. Remember, LOG, guaranteed residual value will be included expressed in present value, of course. So, itong 5,000 na to, na guaranteed residual value, we will include that in order to arrive at our lease liability, which is the sum of their present values here. Lease payments muna. So this is going to be 30,000 multiplied by your present value annuity of 1 for 4 periods at 10%, we arrive at 95,096. Also, for the option, this one, since it's only a one-time payment, we will use present value of 1. In the end, we get 98,511. That is the initial balance of our lease liability, which means this is January 1, 2017. Ay, sorry about that. Basta, yun na yun. 1/1/17. Okay, let's answer number 25. Una, as I mentioned earlier, nakita natin sa options na merong interest expense. So it wouldn't hurt if we can compute first magkano ba yung interest expense. Knowing that the implicit rate is 10% and the lease liability at the beginning of the year is equal to 98,511. Kung i-multiply ko po ang 98,511 by the 10%, I can see that an interest expense value of 9851 actually is there. In our problem, that is letter A. Opo. It's directly disproving letter B and definitely not on letter D. Kasi po ang interest is not really recorded as a payable. That is also something that you should remove for letter C. Your responsibility is to pay 33,000, 30,000 of which is related to the lease payments. So ang entry natin po parang ganito. Interest expense for the amount of 9851, tapos lease liability for the amount of amortization, tapos credit tayo cash. Ito ang magiging entry natin on December 31, 2017 when we settle our first payment of 30,000 related to our lease payments. Yung 3,000 isa-separate mo yon. Debit ka, executory cost, or utilities expense, credit cash 3,000. Pero ito yung mas importante. The amount of interest expense debited is equal to this one. Meanwhile, the amount of lease liability debited is equal to the amortization, which is 30,000 minus the interest expense. Okay, I will not be computing that, and I know you can do it on your own naman. So let's proceed to the next item. Our answer for number 25 is letter A. The next item is annual depreciation. Annual depreciation. Balik tayo sa solution guide natin. Our lease liability on January 1 is 98,511. And you know that this is included in our computation of right of use asset, di ba? Namely, the right of use asset will have the following items in its composition. Ay, sorry about that. Wala pala dyan. Ang ROA po, ang kasama is the initial direct cost, restoration cost, and lease liab. Let's look for initial direct cost and restoration cost in the problem. I will save you some time. There are none. So in this problem po, ang ROA, walang initial direct cost, walang restoration cost, meron lang lease liab. That means if I'm going to compute for ROA, I will have my ROA equal to my lease liability as of January 1, 2017. Mag-equal lang yan sila kasi po wala naman tayo initial direct cost at restoration cost, di ba? So yun po, 4 years ang lease term. Pero, may pero pa dito. Guys, remember earlier, we have a residual value. So, before we proceed, we need to insert here the guaranteed residual value so that we can get the depreciable amount. Okay? Guaranteed residual value natin is 5,000. So, computing that, 98 minus 5,000 will get 93,511, our depreciable amount. That should be the ones to be divided over 4 years para makuha po natin ano ang annual depreciation, which is equal to 23,378. So, alin yon? In our item number 26, it's 23,378, letter C. Alright? So right now guys, we already have answered requirements number 26 and requirements number 25. The following are your answers. Let us now proceed to the last item in this problem, and that is your number 27. For the year ended December 31, 2017, what would Lewis present as lease liability on its statement of financial position? Okay, December 31, 1 year after, ano po ang ipipresent natin as lease liability? This one is simple, and I will teach you the easiest way to arrive at it. Remember that our lease liability on January 1, 2017 is 98,511 and that our implicit rate is 10%. Tapos ang payment natin is 30,000 for the lease, related to the lease only ha. 98,511. All you need to do right now is get that balance of January 2017 lease liability. Tapos, i-deduct natin dyan, i-add natin dyan ano ang interest expense, which is 10% of this. So, that's equal to 9,851 based on our answer earlier, 9,851. So, equal ko na lang siya dito. I-add mo ang interest expense, tapos i-deduct mo ngayon ano ang lease payment, which we already computed earlier as 30,000. So, minus 30,000 here. Okay, let me just fix the number formats. Well, I will fix that one later na lang. Our lease liability on December 31 is equal to 78,362. That is letter C. But I'll give you a pro tip. If you are computing present values, all you need is your calculator. Look at my calcu right now. Input the beginning balance of your lease liab, 98511. Ang gagawin mo po dyan, 98511, i-multiply mo by 1 point effective rate. And since our implicit rate is 10%, i-multiply natin yan by 1.1. After I press equals here, the resulting value is actually equal to 98,511 plus the interest expense of 9851. Okay, na-add ko na yan. So that's 9851 multiplied by 1.1. Ang result niya again is the same as adding these two. Okay? After you do that, you just have to deduct right now magkano ba ang periodic payment or lease payments natin, which is equal to 30,000. So, minus tayo dito ng 30,000. I will get the answer, 78,362. Our letter C, our answer for number 27. It's pretty simple, right? Kaya, sa madalian. Let me do that one more time so that you are convinced that it is really that easy. 98,511 times 1 point effective rate, 1.1, minus 30,000. Kuha ko kagad ano ang present value for the next year or for the end of the year. Okay? So, these are your answers for number 27, number 26, and number 25. Let us proceed to the next one. Guys, for item number 38, I will give you the final answer immediately. This is for the interest of time and so that you will have a challenge for yourself to self-assess on the computations that we have done in the previous problems. So ito po, letter A ang number 28. I will also do the same for number 29. The answer is letter B, suggested answer. Then for number 30, we have letter D. So go ahead and challenge yourselves. Try to answer these problems. But before we end our discussion with lessee accounting, finance lease, we'll have one more, a final problem, which is actually the last problem of this handout. It's about Coco Company and the requirements are right of use asset, depreciation, interest expense, and we are also being asked the lease liability at year end. Okay, objective kagad. And this type of problem, guys, is a standard problem, pro forma problem for lease liability, comprehensive. Pero mas prefer ko ang problem na ganito, guys, kaysa sa paragraph form. Kasi dito, konting basa lang, alam mo na kagad ano ang components. So let's start. We will take into our objective first the right of use asset. Since if we will compute right of use asset, I think all of the other requirements will follow. Kasi po, when you compute right of use asset, of course, depreciation will follow. Your interest expense is computed from your lease liability, which is also part of the right of use asset. And of course, your lease liability end, we will have to compute your lease liability beginning first before we can arrive at the liability end. Okay? So, right of use asset muna tayo. Given, rental payable or lease payments annually is 1 million. Initial direct cost, which if you can remember, it is actually added to our lease liab if we are going to compute right of use asset, diba? So added to. Also, lease incentives, remember the computation earlier? The lease incentive is deducted from initial direct cost para makuha mo yung net initial direct costs. Leasehold improvements. Well, leasehold improvements is not related to right of use asset. It is a separate asset which has its own standard, that is PAS 16. So, that is not right of use asset. Tanggalin natin yan. In this problem, we also have a purchase option, and that purchase option is going to be included in the computation of our lease liability. So it is also included in right of use asset. Take note, ROA is IRL, initial direct cost, restoration cost, and lease liab. Then we have the lease term. We have useful life of the building, which may be useful later when we compute depreciation. There is an implicit rate of 10%, and the present value factors are already given for 5 periods, 10%. We have ordinary annuity, 3.79, and we have PV of 1.62. So let's solve right of use asset. For this, I will be using a solution guide, and I have it here in my Excel file. Ito po, 37 to 40. The term is 5 years, the rate is 10 years, 10%. We have present value factors, so let's start solving. Una, let's determine the lease liability because it's an essential part of our ROA. So that is lease liab, the present value of our lease payments, and the present value of our purchase option, which are in the problem 1 million and 500,000. So let's take their present values, 1 million and 500,000, by multiplying them with their respective present value factors. So the lease payments is going to be multiplied by PV annuity of 1, which is 3.79. To make sure that we have accurate decimal places, I will just type in 3.79. Pero know that it's already here, ha? 1 million times 3.79, that should give us 3,790,000. And then the present value of our option, that is 500,000 multiplied by 0.62. We use PV of 1 here because the option is a term payment. It's not like our lease payments. Our lease payments is an annuity every year. So, ito po. In total, meron tayong lease liability equal to 4,100,000 as computed. And when we try to compute for ROA, it is going to be included here. Okay, 4,100,000, the first component of our ROA. And since based on the given, wala po tayong restoration agreement, so we can eliminate that one completely. Ang meron lang sa problem natin is initial direct cost, and it is going to be net against lease incentives. So we'll just have to input 400,000 and 100,000 in our solution guide as follows. Add lease bonus, 400,000 of course, and then deduct lease incentives of 100,000. Double check the amounts. Yes, 400,000 and 100,000. All in all, we arrive at a ROA equal to 4,400,000. Our answer for number 37, letter C. Solution? Ito po. So that's number 37, your ROA. Let us proceed to number 38 and let us concern ourselves with depreciation. Okay, depreciation. Question, do I use 5 years or 8 years? Ang asset ba matatransfer kay lessee or babalik to kay lessor? Kung babalik siya kay lessor, you will choose the smaller of the two. But if the asset is going to be transferred to the lessee, you will pick useful life always. And in this problem, hindi sinabi explicitly kung matatransfer kay lessee or kung babalik kay lessor yung asset. Pero guys, there are clues in a problem that assumes or that concludes that it will be transferred or it will be returned. And here is what I am talking about. When there is a purchase option that is reasonably certain, it means that the lessee is going to exercise, di ba? Kung i-exercise niya ang purchase option, meaning ang intention ng lessee po is to acquire the ownership of the leased asset. In short, the asset will be transferred to the lessee. And when that is the case, ang gagamitin po natin is our useful life. Regardless of how long the lease term is, kung ang asset matatransfer kay lessee, depreciate it using the useful life. Here is the rule again. Because of the certainty of exercise of the option, the asset will eventually be transferred to the lessee. It will be depreciated using its useful life regardless of any lease term. So, to conclude, 8 years po ang gagamitin natin to depreciate the ROA of 4,400,000. Also take note that there is no guaranteed residual value, so you don't need to worry about depreciable amount. The whole amount is the depreciable amount. To proceed, we'll have to divide 4,400,000 with 8 years, the useful life, to arrive at our answer, 550,000. Solution? Okay, eto na po. Number 39. Interest expense. Well, interest expense, since it is only for the current year, ang kailangan lang natin gawin dyan is we'll have to take the beginning balance of the lease liability and multiply it with the implicit rate of 10%. So, ito lang ang kailangan natin. 10% and the lease liability which we have already computed earlier. So, this is gonna be an easy one since na-compute mo na ang lease liability. We'll have to go ahead and input here 10%. Yan. Then, multiply to arrive at our answer directly. Ito po, sagot, letter A. Diretso na tayo. Number 40 is simply asking us the lease liability again. And this time, ang inihingi niya po is lease liability at the end of the year. We'll have to go with this solution. Beginning lease liability, add interest expense, minus rental payment. This is how it would look like in your amortization table, di ba? Just remember the columns. I-add mo ang interest, i-deduct mo ang payments. So, we knew earlier that the payments is 1 million annually. So, by the end of the year, mababawasan po ng 1 million ang babayarin natin in terms of the lease. In short, our lease liability end will be 3,510,000. Your answer, letter A again. Do take note that you can also arrive at 3,510 using your calculator only, pero that is provided you have already computed the beginning balance of lease liability. So I will do that one again here in this problem. Ginawa ko na to kanina sa problem number 27 ata yun. 4,100,000 multiplied by 1.1, 1 point effective rate, minus 1 million, the payment, you will get 3,510. Ito po yung shortcut natin. And that's it, guys, for our lease liability. We will proceed to the next part of our lesson. But before that, a final glance at the problem and their answers. Okay, so let's proceed now, guys.